For most of history, America seemed to begin with absence, no written names, no known faces, no voices left behind. Then, in the old lake beds of white sands, a colder kind of evidence appeared. Footprints, pressed into mud around 23,000 years ago, during a world still shaped by ice. They do not tell us a tribe, a language, or a homeland. They only show that human bodies were already there, walking across a continent before history could remember them. So the mystery is not only how early they came, but what kind of human story vanished behind those steps. 23,000-year-old footprints in America who walked there before history began. In the oldest layers of human history, the first problem is not that we know too little. The first problem is that almost everything that once mattered left no durable shape. A voice does not fossilize. A name does not sink into mud and remain clear for thousands of years. A memory, even one carried carefully from parent to child, becomes thinner when there is no writing to hold it still. Before cities, before carved records, before maps, and before the borders that later made continents seem settled and named, human life moved through the world in ordinary ways. People walked. They crossed wet ground. They followed water, animals, plants, seasons, and one another. Most of those movements vanished almost as soon as they happened. A foot lifted, a print softened, wind passed over it, water returned, and the earth closed again. That is why the footprints at White Sands feel so strange to the mind. They are not a statue, not a tool held in a museum case, not a wall covered in symbols. They are the outline of pressure. A human body once stood there with enough weight to press itself into the ground, and the ground, by a rare chain of natural events, kept the mark. In that simple contact between skin, mud, and time, the beginning of the American human story becomes less like an idea and more like a physical moment. Around 23,000 years ago, during a world still shaped by ice, someone crossed a landscape that no longer exists in the same form. The place we see today as pale gypsum dunes was once tied to ancient water, lake margins, damp surfaces, and the tracks of animals that also lived in that vanished environment. The people who left those footprints did not leave written explanations beside them. They did not tell us what they called themselves. They did not tell us whether they were passing through, returning to a familiar place, searching for food, avoiding danger, or simply moving through a day that felt ordinary to them. The honest evidence is both powerful and limited. It says that human beings were there. It does not give us permission to invent their thoughts. This is the cold truth behind the mystery. The older history becomes, the more the human presence may be real, while the human story remains silent. For a sleep listener, this silence is not empty. It is wide. It asks us to imagine not fantasy, but distance. Between their feet and our questions lies a span of time so large that entire landscapes changed their face. Lakes retreated. Climates shifted. Animals disappeared. Later peoples came, lived, adapted, remembered, forgot, and were replaced by new generations of memory. Yet, beneath all of that, the footprints remained as a kind of quiet interruption. They do not shout that everything we know is wrong. They ask for something slower and more careful. They ask us to notice that history does not always begin where writing begins. It may begin in mud, in a shoreline, in the brief balance of a body stepping forward. That point matters because the title of this story is not asking for a simple answer, like the name of a lost tribe waiting to be found. It is asking what it means when the ground remembers human movement from a time before history could speak. The footprints are not proof of a vanished civilization in the dramatic sense. They are not a doorway into an invented world. They are more fragile and more important than that. They are evidence that the human beginning in America may reach into a colder, older landscape than many older models once allowed. To look at them carefully is to stand near the edge of knowledge. One can see the mark, but not the face. One can sense the journey, but not complete the map. One can know that someone walked, while still not knowing who they were. That is the quiet paradox at the heart of these prints. The most human trace may also be the one that refuses to become a full story. A footprint is different from almost every other kind of trace because it is not mainly an object made on purpose. A stone tool may carry the shape of intention. A carved mark may suggest a mind trying to leave meaning behind. A shelter, a hearth, or a burial can invite careful questions about habit, need, danger, and belonging. But a footprint begins with something simpler. It begins when the body meets the ground. The person does not need to plan a message. They do not need to know that anyone will ever look back. They only need to move. In that sense, a footprint is one of the most modest records a human being can leave, and also one of the most intimate. It is not a portrait, yet it comes from the living weight of a body. It is not a sentence, yet it says that a moment happened. It does not describe a journey, yet it proves that a step was taken. At White Sands, this matters deeply, because the mystery is not built from a legend or a late memory. It is built from contact. Mud once accepted the shape of human feet, and later conditions helped preserve that shape long enough for modern eyes to study it. The print is quiet, but it is not imaginary. It belongs to the border between biology and history, where the human body becomes the first document. When we think about early people in America, it is easy for the mind to search for grand scenes, migrations across frozen land, long routes along coasts, camps beside water, families moving through unfamiliar terrain. Those larger possibilities matter, but the footprint brings everything down to a smaller and more honest scale. It asks us to begin not with a map, but with a soul touching earth. It reminds us that every human origin story, before it becomes a theory, begins with bodies doing ordinary things in difficult places. Feet carried people before roads existed. Feet measured distance before calendars recorded years. Feet learned the softness of mud, the danger of thin ground, the slope of a bank, the edge of water, the pull of fatigue. In a world before written history, walking was not only travel. It was survival, memory, and contact with the land. Yet the footprint still refuses to become too much. It does not tell us the person's name. It does not tell us whether they were afraid, calm, hungry, tired, or following someone ahead. It does not tell us the language spoken nearby, or the stories told in the evening, or the knowledge passed down through older generations. This restraint is what makes it trustworthy. The evidence gives us presence without pretending to give us everything. A bone can tell us about anatomy. A tool can tell us about technique. A footprint tells us that, for one brief instant, a human being stood in a real place, under real conditions. That is why it feels so close and so distant at the same time. We can almost understand the act because we also walk. Our own bodies still know pressure, balance, soft ground, and tired feet. But we cannot cross the full distance back to the person who made the mark. We share the basic human body while losing almost every surrounding detail of their world. That is the deep human tension inside these prints. The first people whose traces survive in such ancient ground were not characters waiting to be filled in by imagination. They were living bodies within a vanished landscape, connected to food, weather, water, kin, danger, and memory in ways we can approach only carefully. Modern life has changed the meaning of walking. Many people now move across floors, roads, vehicles, and mapped spaces, rarely thinking of the ground as something that records them. But for most of human existence, the body and the surface beneath it were in constant conversation. A footprint at White Sands carries a remnant of that older conversation. It shows that before the continent was divided by names, before history was written, before anyone could argue over dates in books, a human foot pressed into wet earth and left behind the simplest possible evidence. Someone was here. The deepest question raised by the footprints is not only whether people were present in America earlier than many older accounts once assumed. That question matters, but it is only the doorway. The larger question is what kind of beginning we are able to recognize, when the beginning leaves almost no voice. For a long time, history was often imagined through things that could be named clearly: a culture, a tool style, a settlement, a burial ground, a route, a people. These are easier for the mind to hold because they have shape. A footprint is more difficult. It does not give us a people with a finished label. It gives us a human presence before the label can safely be spoken. It asks us to stand in a landscape where the evidence is real, but the story remains unfinished. In that unfinished space, the American past becomes older, quieter, and less obedient to simple lines on a timeline. If human beings were walking near the margins of ancient water around 23,000 years ago, then the beginning of their story on this continent was not waiting for written history, and it was not waiting for later civilizations to make it meaningful. It was already happening in the body. It was happening in steps, in repeated movement, in the slow work of living under cold skies and changing seasons. The old idea of history often begins when people write things down, but the human origin in any land begins much earlier, when bodies learn where water gathers, where ground holds weight, where animals move, where danger may come, and where a group might return. This is why the footprints feel so close to the first page of a book that has lost most of its pages. They do not reveal the full chapter. They only show that the chapter existed. The distance between that ancient step and the present is difficult to feel, because modern life compresses time into dates. A number can look simple on a screen. 23,000 years can be read in a second, but the real distance is not simple. It is longer than agriculture in the Americas, longer than the rise of cities anywhere, longer than written records, longer than the memory systems that later allowed people to preserve names across generations. It reaches back into the late Ice Age, when huge ice sheets shaped parts of the northern continent, when coastlines and environments were not the same as they are now, and when movement across the land would have belonged to a world of limits that no modern map can fully restore. To place a human footprint, there is not to solve everything. It is to feel the weight of the unsolved more clearly. It means that people were not just arriving into a finished world of known places. They were living inside a changing earth, and their traces survived only where nature allowed survival to become evidence. The human beginning in America, seen through these prints, is not a single doorway opening at one neat moment. It is more like a dim shoreline, partly visible, partly covered again by time. Every careful answer creates another careful question. If they were there, how long had people been moving through nearby landscapes before that mud held their steps? What routes had earlier generations followed? What memories guided them across places that later changed beyond recognition? How many lives passed without leaving any mark that survived? These questions cannot be answered by imagination alone. They must remain tied to evidence. Yet the evidence itself invites a slower humility. The footprints do not ask us to replace one certainty with another certainty. They ask us to notice that the first human stories in America may have begun far earlier than the stories that history was able to keep. Before names, before written memory, before the continent could be described from outside, someone walked there. The ground held the pressure. Time covered the world around it. And now, much later, we are left not with a complete answer, but with a human question pressed into earth. White sands can look, at first, like a place made from emptiness. The surface is pale, open and quiet, with dunes that seem almost separate from ordinary earth. A modern visitor may see brightness, dry air and wide space, and feel that the land has always been a desert of white sand. But the footprints ask the mind to remove the present surface slowly, layer by layer. The place that preserved those ancient human steps was not the same dry landscape that the eye meets today. It belonged to the Tularosa Basin, where ancient water once gathered and withdrew, leaving shorelines, muddy flats, mineral deposits, and changing ground behind. Long before the white dunes became the most visible face of the region, there was a lake system, often discussed through the name Lake Otero, and around its margins the earth could be soft enough to receive the pressure of feet. That small physical condition matters. A human footprint cannot be made in pure emptiness. It needs a surface that yields, but not so completely that the mark disappears at once. It needs moisture, fine sediment, timing, and later preservation. The mystery begins, therefore, not with a dramatic scene, but with a meeting between a living body and a temporary landscape. The ground had to be neither too hard nor too fluid. The foot had to press down while the mud held its shape, then other natural events had to protect the mark from being erased. In that sense, the old environment is not a background. It is one of the reasons the evidence exists at all. Around those ancient lake margins, the world would have offered resources and risks that are difficult to reduce to a single image. Water can draw life toward it. Animals leave tracks near it. Plants may grow where dampness remains. Soft ground can hold signs of many moving bodies, not only human ones. At White Sands, Fossil trackways include traces connected with Ice Age animals as well as people, reminding us that human presence was only one thread in a wider living system. The people who crossed that ground were not walking through an empty stage prepared for history. They were moving through an active landscape, shaped by water, sediment, climate, and other creatures. The origin of the human story in America, when seen from this angle, does not begin with a border on a map. It begins near water, near mud, near the practical surfaces that feet had to understand. For most of our species' existence, survival depended on reading places like that without written signs. A shoreline was not just scenery. It could be a path, a danger, a source of food, a place where animals passed, a place where ground changed under each step. Modern people often learn landscapes through names, roads, and screens. Earlier humans had to learn them through repeated contact. The slope underfoot, the damp edge of a basin, the places that held water after weather shifted, the open spaces where movement was possible. None of this lets us claim exactly what those people intended when they walked there. It only helps us understand why the location itself matters. A footprint from such a place is not a random mark in sand. It is a trace born from a vanished environment, one that connected body, water, ground, and time. The dry whiteness of the present can hide that older softness. The silence of the dunes can hide the former lake. The clean horizon can hide the memory of mud. Yet the footprints remain because, for one brief moment in the deep past, the land was soft enough to remember what history could not. A wet shoreline changes the meaning of a human body. On dry stone, a step may leave nothing. On loose sand, it may vanish under wind. In deep water, the body passes without a readable mark. But along the edge of an ancient lake, where mud is soft enough to receive pressure and firm enough to hold shape, walking becomes a kind of record. The person who moved there did not need to write. The foot itself became the writing instrument, and the ground became the page. At White Sands, this connection between body and surface is the center of the evidence. The landscape did not merely surround the people who crossed it. It touched them, resisted them, accepted their weight, and kept a trace of their passage. To understand these footprints, we have to slow the scene down until each step becomes physical again. A foot lowers. The heel presses first, or perhaps the whole sole meets the damp ground. The toes push away. Weight shifts through the leg. The mud compresses, then remains open before drying, filling, or being covered. In that small movement, the human body becomes linked to climate, water, sediment, and time. This is not a story that begins with kings or monuments. It begins with the oldest human tool of travel, the walking body. During the Ice Age world that framed these traces, walking was not a casual act separated from survival. It was the way distance was crossed, places were remembered, resources were reached, and danger was avoided. A body moving along a lake margin had to respond to the ground constantly. Mud could slow the step. Cold air could stiffen movement. Water could attract animals. Open ground could expose a person to weather or distance. The edge of a lake was useful, but it was not simple. It could offer signs of life while also making each step uncertain. This is why the footprints are more than shapes. They carry the meeting point between a human body and a changing environment. We cannot say what the people were thinking, and we should not pretend to know their private world. But we can say that their movement depended on the same basic body plan that still connects us to them. 2 feet, balance, fatigue, attention, and the need to cross real ground. In this way, the footprints return the ancient American story to the beginning of human experience itself. Before tools became elaborate, before settlements became permanent, before any memory could be written down, humans were walkers. Our species spread through the world by repeated bodily contact with landscapes that were never passive. Forests, shorelines, grasslands, ice margins, rivers, deserts, and basins all shaped what movement could mean. White Sands preserves one rare piece of that wider pattern. The old lake margin did not just allow people to pass, it allowed their passing to survive. Modern eyes may see a footprint and think of a symbol, but the mark began as pressure. It was made by soft tissue, bone, muscle, and balance under gravity. It matters because it quietly brings the past back to a scale the body can understand. Everyone knows what it means to place a foot on uncertain ground. Everyone knows the small adjustment that happens when a surface is wet, cold, uneven, or soft. That shared bodily knowledge does not erase the vast distance between us and the people, but it helps us approach the evidence without turning it into fantasy. The ancient lake, the mud, the cold, and the preserved trackway all remind us that the first human presence in a place is not only a date, it is also a relationship between flesh and earth. A continent was not entered only through an idea of migration. It was entered step by step, across surfaces that either forgot the body at once or, in rare cases, remembered it. The strange power of white sands is that the land we see today seems to argue against the land that kept the evidence. A dry, white surface does not easily suggest ancient mud. A bright dune field does not naturally bring to mind a lake margin, damp flats, animal tracks, and human steps pressed into soft ground. The present can make the past look impossible, yet landscapes are not fixed objects. They are slow events. They rise, dry, flood, erode, harden, dissolve, and return in altered forms. A place that now appears empty may once have held water. A place that now reflects sunlight from pale gypsum may once have held the kind of wet sediment that could receive the body's weight. To understand why human footprints survived there, the mind has to let go of the modern scene for a while. The white dunes are not the whole memory of the basin, they are only one later face of it. Beneath that face is the older story of water moving through a closed basin, leaving minerals, shorelines, and surfaces that changed with climate. The footprints belong to that older world, not to the clean desert image that comes first to the eye. This is important because the evidence did not survive by magic. It survived because the environment passed through a rare sequence. First, the ground had to be soft enough for a foot to leave a mark. Then the mark had to avoid being destroyed immediately by more water, wind, trampling, or collapse. Later, sediments and minerals had to help protect the shape. Much later, erosion and study brought the traces back into human attention. Every stage could have failed. Most footprints in human history did fail. For every ancient step preserved, countless others vanished in minutes, days, seasons, or centuries. That is why the surviving marks feel less like ordinary traces and more like accidents of memory. The land did not mean to remember, but under the right conditions, it did. A place that looks dry today once preserved motion because it had once been wet. A place that feels still today once held moving bodies because it had once been alive with water, animals, and people passing through. The origin of the human story in America becomes clearer when we see that the ground itself changed roles. It was first a surface for life, then a container for evidence, then a puzzle for the present. In the life of the people who walked there, the mud was probably not a scientific archive. It was simply ground. It may have been crossed because it lay between one place and another, because water drew movement toward it, because animals left signs nearby, or because a path along the basin edge was possible. We cannot safely narrow the reason to one imagined moment, but we can say that the place was part of a living landscape, not an empty stage. Later, after the steps were made, the same landscape slowly removed almost everything that would help us understand them fully. It did not keep voices. It did not keep daily gestures. It did not keep the small knowledge by which people recognize safe ground, useful plants, animal movement, or changes in weather. It kept the pressure of feet. That is a severe kind of memory. It gives the body back, but not the whole life around the body. Modern white sands therefore carries a quiet contradiction. Its surface appears clean, pale, and almost timeless, but its buried and exposed traces speak of change. The white ground does not cancel the lake. The desert does not cancel the mud. The silence does not cancel the human movement that once crossed it. In a deeper sense, the place teaches us that the beginning of history is often hidden under a later landscape. We look at what exists now and assume it explains what existed then, but the footprints warn against that easy habit. They show that the present is only the last visible layer. Before the dunes, there was water. Before the dry brightness, there was damp earth. Before written history, there were feet moving through a world that could still hold their weight long enough to remember. 23,000 years can sound clean when it is spoken as a number. It fits easily into a title, a sentence, or a line on a timeline. But the world behind that number was not clean or simple. It belonged to the late Ice Age, during a period when great ice sheets covered huge parts of northern North America and reshaped the meaning of distance. The continent that appears open on a modern map was not open in the same way then. Ice, cold, meltwater, changing coastlines, exposed land, animal ranges, and difficult seasonal conditions all made movement far more complex than a straight arrow drawn across a page. This is why the footprints at White Sands carry such weight. They do not sit in an easy period after the ice had withdrawn and the land had become familiar to later imagination. They appear to belong to a colder, older setting, close to the time when glacial conditions were at or near their strongest. That does not mean every question is solved. It means the question becomes larger. If people were walking in what is now New Mexico at such an early time, then the human story in America must be considered inside the pressure of an Ice Age world, not only after that world had relaxed. A date by itself can seem distant but harmless. A date placed inside climate becomes more serious. Around that deep time, sea levels were lower because so much water was locked in ice. Northern landscapes were transformed by glacial barriers. Some environments that exist today did not exist in the same form, and some paths that later people used may have been closed, altered, or difficult in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. For older models of how people reached and spread through the Americas, timing has always mattered, because the opening or closing of routes changes what kinds of movement seem possible. When evidence points to human presence earlier than a simple late arrival story allows, it does not give us permission to invent a dramatic answer. But it does make the older simplicity harder to hold. The footprints do not say exactly how people came. They do not point to one safe route, one single migration, or one complete origin. They only place human feet within a period when any journey across or into the continent would have required generations of movement, adaptation, and knowledge. The beginning of human life in America, from this perspective, does not look like one sudden arrival. It looks more like a long human edge pressing against a changing earth. This returns us to the body. A glacial world is often imagined from above as maps of ice and arrows of movement, but no one lived inside those maps. People lived at ground level. They felt cold as air on skin. They crossed uneven surfaces with legs and feet. They needed water, food, rest, shelter, and social memory. They had to notice what a place offered and what it refused. The White Sands footprints matter because they bring a huge climatic period down to the scale of a step. A vast ice age becomes a damp surface under one human foot. A continental question becomes pressure in mud. That is why the number cannot be treated as decoration. It changes the mood of the evidence. It asks us to imagine human presence not in a finished, settled America, but in a world where climate still held enormous power over land and movement. Later histories often begin with places that have names. The people who left these traces lived before those names reached us. Their world was not empty, but it is mostly unnamed to us now. The ice age around them was not simply a cold background. It shaped the possible routes, the available habitats, the movement of animals, the edges of lakes, and the fragile conditions that allowed a footprint to survive. So when we hear 23,000 years, the real meaning is not only age, it is exposure. It is the thought of human beings already present within a continent, still being formed by ice, water, and time, leaving behind not a full story, but a mark that makes the old beginning harder to place neatly and impossible to dismiss. The early date makes the story harder because it places human presence in America inside a world that was not yet easy to cross, in the way a modern imagination might expect. When people look at a map today, the continents appear finished. North America has coasts, rivers, deserts, forests, mountains, and borders that can be named. A route can be traced with a finger in seconds. But the Ice Age world was not a flat drawing. It was a moving system of ice, water, land, animals, seasons, and risk. The northern parts of the continent were deeply affected by enormous ice sheets. Sea levels were lower than today because so much water was locked away in ice. Coastlines were different. Some routes that might appear open in one period could have been blocked or changed in another. A path that seems possible from far above may have been impossible, dangerous, or simply unknown at ground level. This is why the white sand's footprints do not make the question smaller, they make it larger. If people were already walking in what is now New Mexico around that deep time, then their presence must have a deeper background than the moment preserved in the mud. A footprint is never the true beginning of a journey. It is only the place where a journey happened to touch a surface that survived. Before that step, there may have been other steps, other generations, other landscapes, and other forms of knowledge that left no mark at all. This does not mean we should imagine a grand lost civilization or invent a complete story. It means the timing forces caution. The evidence does not hand us a finished migration route. It only tells us that the old human map of America may have been more complex than a single late movement across an open corridor. Earlier models often leaned on the idea that people entered the Americas after certain ice-free routes became available. That idea had a clear shape, which made it easy to teach and easy to picture. But evidence from places such as White Sands has made the older, simpler picture more difficult to hold without adjustment. If human beings were present so early, then the question becomes not only when they arrived, but what kinds of movements, pauses, coastal possibilities, inland landscapes, and generational changes may have come before the marks we can see. Each answer must remain tied to evidence, because this is where truth matters most. The footprints do not prove every possible route. They do not tell us whether people moved mostly along coasts, through interior regions, or by more than one path over long spans of time. They do not tell us how many groups were involved. They do not give us names. They only sit there, quietly disturbing the neatness of a story that once seemed easier. This is also where the human body returns to the center. Migration is often spoken about as if whole populations moved like arrows. Real people do not move like arrows. They move as bodies, families, small groups, and generations. They stop when weather changes. They remember where water was found. They follow animals only if the land and season allow it. They carry children, tools, knowledge, hunger, fatigue, and fear without leaving most of those things behind for archaeologists to find. A route across a continent is not made only by bold movement. It is made by repeated survival in smaller places. The people behind the White Sands footprints were part of that older human condition. They were not abstract markers on a timeline. They were living bodies inside a climate system larger than themselves. The difficulty of the date is therefore not only scientific, it is emotional in a quiet way. It reminds us that the human beginning in America may have been a long and fragile process, mostly erased except where rare conditions preserved a trace. The old mud did not record the whole path. It recorded one meeting between foot and earth. Yet that small meeting is enough to make the continent feel older in human terms. It suggests that before history could name the walkers, before later cultures could be recognized more clearly, and before written memory existed anywhere near this story, human beings may already have been finding ways to live within a land still shaped by ice. The date does not close the mystery. It deepens the ground beneath it. The danger of an early footprint is that the mind wants to make it do more than it can do. A mark in mud can feel so immediate that it seems to open a door into a complete hidden world. But evidence is strongest when it remains exactly what it is. The White Sands footprints show human presence in a very old landscape. They do not, by themselves, show the full road that led there. They do not reveal whether earlier generations moved along a coast, through an interior passage, across now changed terrain, or by more than one path over a long span of time. They do not settle every debate about the peopling of the Americas. They make the debate more careful. This is the calm discipline required by ancient evidence. A footprint is not a map. It is one point where a human body and a surface met, and because that meeting survived, it now pulls larger questions toward it. The temptation is to rush from the mark to a story, from the story to a conclusion, and from the conclusion to certainty. But deep history rarely works that way. It gives us fragments that are real, and then asks us to resist filling the empty spaces too quickly. The people who walked near the ancient lake were part of the wider human movement across the planet, but the exact shape of their route remains beyond what the prints alone can say. That limitation is not a weakness. It is what keeps the mystery honest. If we remember the beginning of humans as a species, the same pattern appears again and again. Human beings spread not through one perfect line, but through many acts of movement, stopping, adapting, and surviving. A population may shift gradually over generations. A shoreline may guide movement for a time, then disappear under rising seas. An inland route may open after climate changes, while another closes under ice or drought. A camp may be used and then lost without trace. A tool may survive in one place, while the footsteps that carried it vanish elsewhere. The visible record is always thinner than the living reality that produced it. White sands is powerful because it adds a physical point to that thin record, but it does not turn the past into a finished picture. It is like seeing one lamp far back in darkness. The lamp proves there was someone there, but it does not light the entire road behind them. This is especially important when speaking about time before history began in the written sense. Without written witnesses, there is no safe way to know the names people used, the stories they told, or the memories that guided their movement. Archaeology can study traces, dates, sediments, tools, bones, and landscapes. It can compare evidence and revise older models. But it cannot turn silence into speech without crossing into invention. The footprints therefore ask for patience. They ask us to accept that the first human presence in America may be older and more complex than a simple timeline, while also accepting that complexity is not permission to claim anything. The open question remains open, because that is where the evidence leaves us. Perhaps future discoveries will clarify routes, timing, and relationships between ancient populations. Perhaps some clues have already been lost underwater, eroded ground, or landscapes that change too much to preserve them. For now, the footprints stand as a boundary marker between knowledge and humility. They say that humans were there in a deep Ice Age setting, walking across ground that later became part of a very different world. They do not tell us everything that came before. They do not explain how far back the unseen steps extend. They leave us with a quieter form of wonder, not the excitement of a solved secret, but the patience of looking at a true mark and admitting that the road leading to it is still partly hidden. A human footprint can look simple because it is small, compared with the scale of the question around it. The question reaches across continents, ice sheets, ancient routes, and thousands of years, while the print itself may be no larger than a living foot. Yet that smallness is exactly what makes it valuable. It brings the immense past down to the scale of the body. A footprint is not only a mark of location, it is also a trace of weight. It shows that a human body once pressed downward with enough force to change the surface beneath it. The ground was not merely seen or crossed from a distance. It was physically altered by contact. In that contact, biology enters archaeology. Bones may preserve the shape of a body after death. Tools may preserve skill, but a footprint preserves a moment when a living body was upright, balanced, and moving. It is evidence of pressure, direction, timing, and ground condition, all held in one fragile shape. At White Sands, this matters because the footprints are not just signs that someone existed somewhere in a vague past. They are signs that someone stood and walked in a very particular landscape. The shape of a print may reflect the softness of the surface, the angle of movement, the depth of pressure, and the way weight passed through the foot. Scientists must study these marks carefully because mud can distort, collapse, or preserve unevenly. Not every hollow is simple to read, yet the basic meaning remains powerful. A living human body touched that ground. The body had mass, it had balance, it moved through space rather than merely appearing as a point on a map. This is one reason footprints feel different from many other discoveries. They keep the past close to motion. They do not show a person frozen as an object. They show the effect of movement after the mover is gone. The origin of human life in America becomes, for a moment, not an argument about labels, but a bodily fact. People who walked there had feet shaped by the long evolution of our species. They belonged to the same broad human line that had already depended on walking for countless generations before reaching the Americas. Long before roads, animals, wheels, or written geography, the human body carried knowledge through repeated movement. Feet were not only supports. They were instruments of contact with the world. Through them, a person could feel slope, firmness, mud, gravel, water, and fatigue. A step could be quick, slow, careful, heavy, or uncertain depending on ground and circumstance. We must be careful not to read private emotion into the White Sands prints. A deep impression does not automatically mean fear or exhaustion. A line of movement does not automatically reveal purpose, but the prints still allow a modest form of understanding. They show that the walkers were not mythic figures. They were human bodies under gravity, negotiating a surface that responded to them. That is already enough to change the mood of the evidence. The earliest traces do not need to be grand in order to be meaningful. A single trackway can remind us that history begins with bodies before it begins with stories. Today, many people are separated from the ground by floors, shoes, vehicles, pavement, and mapped routes. We often know where we are through signs and screens more than through the feel of the earth itself. The White Sands footprints point back toward an older human condition, when the ground was not background but information. Every surface mattered because every surface could help or hinder movement. Wet mud could slow a person down. A firmer strip near water could become a path. The edge of a basin could collect animal tracks, plant growth, and human attention. In that world, direction was not an abstract line. It was made step by step through the body's relation to terrain. The footprints do not tell us the full route, but they preserve the fact that such bodily navigation happened. They show weight without a name, direction without a map, and presence without a voice. Their quiet force comes from that balance. They are biological, because only a living body could make them. They are archaeological, because only preservation made them visible to us. And they are historical in the deepest sense, because they place human movement before written memory, where the first record is not a word, but the pressure of a foot in earth. The people behind the White Sands footprints should be approached through what the evidence can carry, not through what modern imagination wants to place upon them. It is possible to say that they were human beings. It is possible to say that their feet pressed into wet ground in a landscape shaped by ancient water and ice age conditions. It is possible to say that their bodies moved through a real place before written history could preserve names or voices. But beyond that, caution becomes necessary. We cannot safely describe their language. We cannot know the stories they told. We cannot know what they believed about the land, the sky, animals, death, or the path ahead. We cannot look at a trackway and hear their private thoughts. This restraint may seem small, but it is one of the most important forms of honesty in deep history. The older the evidence becomes, the easier it is to fill silence with certainty. Yet the silence is part of the truth. The footprints show the body, not the whole person. They show presence, not identity. They show movement, not motive. To speak about early humans carefully is not to make them less human. It is to respect how much of their lives time has taken away. Their bodies were not strange in the way myth makes ancient people strange. They belong to our species, with the same basic human need for balance, warmth, water, rest, food, protection, and social life. A foot pressing into mud around an ancient lake is not a supernatural trace. It is an ordinary biological act, preserved under extraordinary conditions. That ordinary quality matters. It keeps the past close to the long beginning of humanity, when survival depended less on written plans and more on bodies learning landscapes directly. A person walking at White Sands would have had to deal with ground, weather, distance, fatigue, and the living world around the basin. These are not guesses about emotion. They are basic conditions of being human in an open environment. The human body is not separate from place. It is always shaped by the surfaces it crosses, the climate it endures, and the resources it needs. In this sense, the footprints remind us that ancient history is not only about artifacts. It is also about anatomy and motion. Feet, knees, hips, spine, breath, and attention all belong to the act of crossing land. Even when no tool is visible in the print, the body itself was using an ancient form of knowledge, how to move without falling, how to adjust to softness, how to continue across distance. Modern people still carry that body, but often in a changed relationship with the world. Shoes, roads, floors, vehicles, and signs have softened the old conversation between foot and ground. We still walk, but we rarely need to read mud, slope, animal tracks, water edges, or open terrain with the same daily seriousness. This is one quiet form of evolutionary loss, not because the body has become less human, but because the environment no longer demands the same constant contact. The white sands prints point back toward a time when every step could be part of survival knowledge, yet even here, the evidence must remain grounded. A footprint cannot tell us whether a person was confident or uncertain. It cannot prove whether the day was dangerous or calm. It cannot turn a track into a full biography. What it can do is make the remote past physical. It gives us a body without a face, a movement without a voice, a trace without a story. That may be why it feels so powerful. The footprints do not ask us to invent people from nothing. They ask us to recognize that real people existed where the record is almost silent. They were not symbols of a mystery. They were not placeholders for a theory. They were human bodies living within a changing land, leaving behind only what mud and time happened to keep. To stand before such evidence in the mind is to feel both closeness and distance at once. The closeness comes from the foot, because we understand walking. The distance comes from everything else, because the lives behind the steps remain largely beyond recovery. There is a quiet loss hidden inside the way modern people move. We still have feet, balance, muscles, and the same basic upright body that once crossed ancient lake margins. But many of the older conversations between body and ground have been softened or removed. A paved road does not speak like mud. A floor does not change under the foot the way wet sediment changes. A vehicle can carry a person across distances that once required attention to slope, water, weather, and fatigue. A map can show a route without allowing the body to feel the land. These comforts are real, and they protect us in many ways. Yet they also create distance from an older human sense of place. The white sands footprints make that distance visible. They remind us that for most of human existence, the ground was not merely something beneath the body. It was information. It told people where water had been, where animals had passed, where a surface might hold or fail, where movement would be easy or costly. To walk was not only to go from one point to another, it was to read the world through pressure, touch, balance, and memory. The people who left those ancient marks in what is now New Mexico lived within that older relationship. We should not pretend to know their thoughts, but we can recognize the physical world their bodies had to meet. The softness of a lake margin, the pull of mud around the foot, the firmness of drier ground nearby, the openness of a basin, the presence of water in a harsh climate, all of these would have shaped movement at ground level. A modern map can flatten such a place into an area. A human foot feels it as a sequence of small decisions. This is where the footprints carry more than age. They carry a reminder of how human knowledge once began in contact. Before written directions, before roads, before borders, before recorded history, the body learned by repeating movements through real places. People knew landscapes because they had crossed them, returned to them, avoided some surfaces, followed others, and remembered what the ground had taught. The origin of human life in America, seen through these marks, was not only a migration problem, it was also an embodied problem. How a human body found its way through a continent still shaped by Ice Age climate, ancient water, and changing land. That relationship has not disappeared from us completely. A person still slows down on slippery ground. A foot still adjusts when soil is soft. The body still understands uneven terrain before the mind puts words to it. But in much of modern life, these signals have become quieter. We often move through designed surfaces that protect us from the old uncertainty. We may know our location through screens more than through wind, slope, water, or tracks. In this sense, the footprints at White Sands do not only point backward to an ancient walker, they also point inward, towards something our species once depended on more heavily, the ability to belong physically to a landscape. This is not a claim that ancient life was better or purer. It was often harder, more exposed, and more limited by conditions we would find severe. The point is more careful than nostalgia. It is that the human body evolved in close conversation with ground, weather, distance, and other living things. The old footprints preserve one sentence from that conversation. They show a body still fully inside the land, leaving evidence through contact rather than intention. Today we can study the mark from far away, place it in a scientific timeline, and speak about its age. Yet the mark itself remains stubbornly bodily. It says that before America was a historical idea, before its earliest people could be named by records, before the old lake became white dunes, someone's foot met the earth with enough force to be remembered. The loss is that we can see the trace, but we can no longer feel the world that made such tracing ordinary. The question, who walked there, sounds simple only because language makes it simple. In reality, the evidence gives one answer clearly and withholds nearly everything else. Human beings walked there. That is the firm centre. Not a legend, not a rumour, not a later memory, but human presence pressed into ancient ground. Yet the moment we ask who they were, the ground becomes quieter. A footprint does not carry a personal name. It does not carry a family line that can be read directly from the mud. It does not identify a language, a group name, a belief, a homeland, or a destination. It tells us that a human body was present in that place under conditions that allowed the mark to form and survive. That is already profound, but it is not the same as knowing a people in the full human sense. This difference is one of the most important boundaries in the story of White Sands. There is a wide space between evidence of presence and knowledge of identity. The footprints stand in that space. They are strong enough to change how old the question feels, but not strong enough to turn ancient walkers into named figures. In deep history, that distinction protects the truth. Without it, the imagination can easily place too much weight on a fragile trace. The origin of human life in America was not made by labels written backward onto silent evidence. It was made by living people, and most of what made them fully human has not survived in a form we can safely describe. They may have belonged to communities with memory, skill, kinship, and knowledge of landscape, because human beings everywhere depend on shared life in some form. But the exact shape of that life cannot be pulled from a footprint alone. We can approach the surface of the fact, not the whole interior of their world. This is why the mystery is not weakened by caution. It becomes deeper. A false certainty would make the story smaller. It would give the listener a quick answer and close the door too soon. The honest evidence keeps the door open. It allows us to say, with care, that people were present in a part of North America during a very ancient period. It allows us to connect their presence to a lake margin, to mud, to Ice Age landscapes, and to human movement. But it does not allow us to say exactly what they called themselves or how they understood their place in the world. That missing identity is not an empty detail. It is the central silence. The people behind the footprints were not less real because they are unnamed. In fact, their namelessness may bring them closer to most of humanity. For most of our species' existence, people lived, moved, loved, taught, feared, adapted, and died without leaving written names. Their lives were not incomplete to them, but they are incomplete to us. Archaeology often works at this edge. It finds traces of activity while the full human voice remains gone. A tool can show shaping. A hearth can suggest fire. A bone can reveal anatomy. A footprint can show movement. None of these alone can restore the private world of the person. White Sands therefore teaches a slower kind of respect. The right question is not only, who were they, as if the answer were hidden just beyond the next sentence. The right question is how much of a human life can vanish while still leaving enough evidence to disturb our timeline. We see the step, but not the face. We see presence, but not identity. We see the beginning of a story, but not the people's own words for it. That is why the footprints remain powerful without becoming a myth. They remind us that before history could name the walkers were already real. Every ancient trace has a boundary, and the boundary of a footprint is especially severe. It can show where a foot pressed into a surface, but it cannot speak the language of the person who made it. It can suggest movement, but it cannot give the reason for that movement. It can preserve the shape of a step, but not the voice that may have called across the lake margin, not the memory carried by the group, not the shames used for water, animals, danger, or home. This is why the White Sands footprints must be held carefully. They are strong evidence of human presence, but they are not a complete human archive. A footprint is a doorway into the past, not the room itself. When archaeologists study ancient sites, they work with remains that survived by chance, burial, mineral change, dryness, wetness, or other natural conditions. The record is never the whole life. It is only the part of life that endured long enough to be found. At White Sands, mud kept the pressure of feet, but it did not keep the words that once surrounded those feet. It did not keep the gestures of teaching, the small decisions of a day, the social bonds, the fears, the songs, or the practical knowledge that may have helped people move through that basin. To admit this does not weaken the discovery. It protects it from being turned into something false. The older human history becomes, the more tempting it is to use silence as empty space for imagination. But silence in archaeology is not empty. It is evidence of loss. It tells us that real lives were present, while most of the forms by which people understood those lives have disappeared. This is especially important for a discovery that reaches so far before written history. A written record can sometimes preserve a name, a conflict, a trade, a belief, or a memory. A footprint cannot do that. It belongs to the body, not to speech. It brings the deep human beginning back to the simplest level. A person had weight, balance, and direction. The rest must be approached only through other evidence, and where that evidence is absent, the honest answer must remain open. The people who walk there may have belonged to a wider population history that connected them to movements across ancient landscapes, but the footprints alone cannot define that history completely. They cannot identify one migration route. They cannot reveal how many generations had already lived in or moved through nearby regions. They cannot tell us whether the place was familiar or new to the walkers. They cannot tell us what the day meant to them. This gap between physical presence and human meaning is the heart of the mystery. It also brings us closer to the general condition of human origins. Most early people did not leave complete records. They left scattered signs: stone, bone, charcoal, sediment, DNA in rare cases, and sometimes, under rare conditions, footprints. From these signs, science builds cautious models, compares dates, revises old assumptions, and waits for stronger evidence where questions remain unsettled. That process is slower than a dramatic story, but it is more valuable because it respects the dead and the unknown. White Sands does not need invented certainty to matter. Its importance lies in the fact that a small trace can force a large question to remain alive. Who walked there before history began? The most truthful answer begins with the modest fact that humans did. After that, the ground becomes quiet again. We can study the mud, the age, the environment, and the pattern of movement. We can place the footprints within the late Ice Age and within the wider debate over early human presence in America, but we cannot turn the walkers into named characters. We cannot give them thoughts just because we want the past to feel complete. What remains is more patient and more human, a recognition that identity can vanish while presence survives, and that some of the earliest American history may be known first, not through words, but through the marks of feet that outlived the voices above them. The silence around the White Sands footprints is not a blank space where anything can be placed. It is a kind of evidence in itself. It tells us how much of early human life did not survive in forms we can hear, read, or hold. When we imagine history, we often look for voices. We want someone to tell us what happened, who was there, where they came from, and what they believed they were doing. But before written records, before named cities, before fixed borders, most human lives passed through the world without leaving that kind of explanation. They were not silent to themselves. They spoke, remembered, taught, warned, guided, and learned. Their days were full of meaning inside their own communities. The silence belongs to us, not to them. It is the silence created when time removes the words but leaves behind a mark in the ground. That is why the footprints feel so different from an ordinary clue. They do not offer a story spoken by the past. They force the present to become careful. A step remains, but the voice above it is gone. A body is recorded, but the person's inner world is not. A path appears, but its purpose remains beyond reach. This is where history begins to feel older than history itself. It begins not as a written account, but as a trace that asks to be respected without being completed by imagination. In this sense, the footprints are not only about America, they are about the whole human condition before writing. For most of our species' existence, people lived in histories that were carried by memory, relationship, place, and practice rather than by documents. A child learned from older people, a group remembered water, shelter, danger, and seasonal change. Knowledge moved through bodies and voices. But voices are fragile. They live only while someone carries them forward. If a chain breaks, the sound disappears. The ground, strangely, can sometimes outlast the voice. Mud can keep what language could not. A shoreline can preserve the pressure of a foot after every spoken name has vanished. The beginning of human life in America, seen through white sands, therefore arrives in a form that is both deeply physical and deeply incomplete. It is not a mythic beginning with a clear first person standing at the edge of a continent. It is a preserved fragment from a much larger human presence. The fragment matters because it reminds us that the earliest chapters were lived before they were recorded. The land may hold a trace long after memory has lost its shape, yet that does not mean the trace becomes a full narrative. It remains a sign of real life under conditions we can study only from the outside. There is a calm humility in admitting this. The people who walked there were not invented because the evidence is limited. They were real precisely because the evidence is physical. But their reality does not belong entirely to our curiosity. We can say that human beings moved across damp ground in an ancient basin. We can say that the environment was different from the dry, white landscape now visible. We can say that the timing places the marks deep in an Ice Age world. Beyond that, the silence must be allowed to remain. The footprints turn absence into a serious question, not into an excuse for certainty. They show that history does not always begin with an answer. Sometimes it begins with a refusal to disappear completely. A human foot pressed into mud. The mud held the pressure. The lake changed. The landscape dried. The world moved on. Later, after thousands of years, the mark returned to sight, carrying no name and no explanation, only the fact that someone had been there. That may be the deepest value of the discovery. It teaches us that the first evidence of a people can be smaller than a sentence and still larger than a monument. It can be no more than a step and still open the question of an entire continent before memory began. The footprints at White Sands do not stand alone in the story of the first people in America. They belong to a wider and still carefully studied question about when, how, and by what routes human beings entered and spread through the continents of the Western Hemisphere. For many years, a simpler version of the story was easier to imagine. People came late, after the great ice sheets allowed passage, and then moved into new lands. That picture had a clean shape. It gave the mind a beginning, a route, and a direction. But human history is rarely so clean when the evidence becomes older. Archaeological sites, genetic studies, changing climate models, and landscape reconstructions have made the story more complex. White Sands is important because it adds a very physical kind of evidence to that complexity. It does not replace every other clue. It does not erase the need for caution. It simply places human feet in North America at a deep Ice Age moment, and that placement asks all older models to make room for a longer and more layered human presence. This does not mean the continent was filled everywhere in the way later history might imagine. It does not mean every region had people at the same time. It does not mean a single group can be traced neatly from one point to another. It means that one landscape, in what is now New Mexico, preserved signs of humans earlier than many simple accounts once expected. From that small physical fact, the larger story must remain open. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about human movement not as a single event, but as a process across generations. A population does not enter a continent the way a person enters a room. Movement can take place slowly, unevenly, with pauses, retreats, separations, and local adaptations. Some groups may follow coasts when they are usable. Some may move through inland corridors when climate allows. Some may remain near familiar habitats for long periods before later generations move farther. Sea levels rise and hide old shorelines. Ice opens and closes routes. Rivers change their courses. Desert basins dry. Lakes appear and vanish. The origin of human life in America must be placed within that moving earth. White Sands gives us a point of contact, not the whole path. It is like finding one preserved breath in a long, vanished conversation. The breath is real, but the full conversation is still missing. This is why the footprints should not be treated as proof of a dramatic lost civilization or as a simple answer to every question about America's earliest people. Their value is quieter and stronger. They show that human presence may have been woven into the continent earlier and more deeply than the old, neat story allowed. They make the land feel less like an empty stage waiting for later history, and more like a place already crossed, noticed, and lived in by people whose names are gone. That shift matters because modern history often begins with records, settlements, and visible structures, but the human beginning in a land often begins long before those things. It begins with movement through weather, water, animals, stone, plants, mud, and memory. It begins with bodies learning what a place permits. White Sands reminds us that the first American past we can touch may not look like a village, a monument, or a written mark. It may look like feet moving beside an ancient lake. Around those feet, the larger scientific question remains careful and unfinished. How early did people arrive? Which routes were possible at which times? How many movements were involved? What evidence has been lost beneath later seas, eroded ground, or landscapes that no longer preserve traces well? The footprints do not answer all of this. They only make the questions more serious. They tell us that any honest story of the first people in America must leave space for evidence that is small, physical, and difficult to fit into older patterns. A continent that once seemed to begin late in human terms now holds marks that reach back into a colder world. And because the marks are footprints, not words, they ask us to follow the evidence slowly, one step at a time. A discovery like White Sands does not destroy the older story of human arrival in America in one dramatic blow. It works more quietly than that. It places pressure on any version of the story that is too simple. For a long time, many people learned a clean outline. Humans entered the Americas near the end of the Ice Age, after routes became easier, and then spread southward. That outline had a certain order, and order is comforting. It made a vast question feel teachable. But the deeper record of archaeology does not always follow the shape of a classroom diagram. Evidence appears in different places, under different conditions, with different strengths and uncertainties. Some discoveries are debated, some are widely accepted, some force old models to bend rather than break. The White Sands footprints belong to that slower process of revision. They do not give us a complete replacement story, but they make it difficult to speak as if the first human presence in America must have been late, simple, and neatly tied to one opening in the ice. If people were walking in what is now New Mexico in a deep Ice Age setting, then the human past on this continent must be given more time, more uncertainty, and more room. That shift matters because it changes the emotional shape of the continent. A late, simple arrival can make the land seem like an empty place waiting for people to enter it. An earlier and more complex record suggests something different. It suggests that people were already part of certain landscapes, while the Ice Age world was still shaping the possibilities of life. They were not standing outside history, waiting for history to begin. They were already inside the land, moving through lake margins, changing climates, animal worlds, and surfaces that could sometimes remember their steps. The origin of human life in America becomes less like a single gate opening and more like a long edge of human presence slowly becoming visible through fragments. This does not mean every older idea must be thrown away carelessly. Science does not become stronger by replacing caution with excitement. It becomes stronger by allowing evidence to disturb what was too neat, while still refusing to invent what cannot be shown. White Sands does not prove exactly how many movements into the Americas took place. It does not prove that one route was the only route. It does not prove that all regions were occupied at the same time. What it does is make a very early presence harder to ignore. It asks why human feet were already there, and what earlier steps may have existed beyond the reach of preservation. In that way, the footprints act like a quiet weight placed on the old timeline. They do not shout. They press. They remind us that the visible record may begin after the real human process had already been unfolding for generations. This is common in deep history. The first surviving evidence is rarely the first actual moment. The earliest footprint we find may not be the earliest footprint ever made. The earliest tool at a site may not be the first tool used there. The earliest preserved campsite may not be the first human shelter in a region. Preservation is uneven, and time is selective. Water can erase one place while protecting another. Rising seas can hide coastlines that may once have mattered. Dryness can preserve some traces while wind destroys others. The record that reaches us is not a complete map of the past. It is a damaged surface with a few marks still visible. White sands is one of those marks, and its age makes the damaged surface look much larger than before. The older simple story is shaken not because the footprints answer everything, but because they refuse to fit comfortably inside a narrow version of arrival. They show that a continent once imagined through late entry and rapid spread may have held older human movement, older adaptation, and older lives without leaving many durable signs. That is not a myth of a vanished civilization. It is a more grounded mystery. People were there, but the full pathway that brought them there remains partly hidden. The honest wonder is not that the past suddenly becomes magical. It is that the ordinary act of walking can make a long-held timeline feel too small. The safest way to understand white sands is to let the footprints be important, without forcing them to become something they are not. They are not proof of a hidden city. They are not proof of an advanced, vanished society. They are not a sign that every established idea about early America must be thrown away and replaced with a dramatic secret. Their power is quieter. They show that human beings were present in a very old North American landscape, and that this presence may reach farther back into Ice Age time than many older, simpler accounts once allowed. That is already enough. A footprint does not need to become a monument in order to change the way history feels. A mark made by a living body can shift the edge of a timeline because it tells us that people were there, walking through mud, water, cold, and distance before the later record became easier to see. The danger is that mystery can become inflated when the evidence is small. A small trace can invite a very large story, and if the story grows faster than the evidence, truth becomes blurred. White sand deserves the opposite treatment. Its importance comes from restraint. It asks us to say only what can be said carefully. The ground preserved human footprints in an ancient basin. The timing places them deep in the late Ice Age. The people who made them remain unnamed. And the route that brought humans into that broader world remains a question with several possibilities, not a finished answer. This kind of caution may seem less exciting at first, but it makes the discovery stronger. It allows the footprints to sit where they truly belong, between evidence and silence. The human beginning in America does not have to be wrapped in fantasy to be profound. It is profound because the ordinary act of walking reached across thousands of years and survived long enough to ask a question we still cannot fully close. A continent does not become human only when it has cities, fields, roads, temples, or written accounts. It becomes human when people begin to live in relation to its water, animals, seasons, dangers, and paths. White sands gives us a rare trace of that earlier relation. It does not show a civilization in the later sense. It shows presence. It shows bodies moving through a landscape that has since changed almost beyond recognition. That presence is modest, but it is not small. It means that the deep American past includes people who were already learning, crossing, returning, adapting, and surviving in places where most of their traces would never last. The footprints make the continent feel less empty in deep time, not because they fill it with invented scenes, but because they remove the illusion that absence of evidence is the same as absence of life. For every print that survived, many vanished. For every surface that preserved a step, countless surfaces forgot. This is why the early presence at White Sands should be treated as a doorway into a more complex human landscape, not as a final key. It reminds us that history often begins before the objects we usually expect. It may begin before settled villages, before agriculture, before written symbols, before the kinds of remains that make the past easy to classify. It may begin with people whose entire world was real to them but almost invisible to us. The footprints are therefore not a sensational proof of something hidden in the dramatic sense. They are a careful proof of something deeper and more human. Our timelines can be too narrow, our categories can be too neat, and the ground may preserve human presence where memory did not. To follow the evidence honestly is to accept both sides at once. Humans were there. We do not fully know who they were. Their presence was ancient. Their story remains incomplete. That balance is the truth that White Sands gives us, and it is more valuable than a false certainty because it leaves the mystery alive without breaking it. A footprint often makes the mind imagine one person. One foot, one step, one body, one moment. That is natural, because the mark itself is small enough to feel individual, but in deep history, a footprint rarely belongs only to itself. It is the visible edge of a much larger human process. The person who pressed a foot into the wet ground at White Sands did not appear from nowhere. Behind that step were other bodies, other movements, other remembered places, and likely many earlier decisions made by people whose traces did not survive. A single footprint can be made in an instant, but the presence that brought a human being to that place may have taken generations. This is one reason the discovery feels so heavy. It does not simply ask who stood there in that moment. It asks how many lives came before that moment without leaving anything as clear. The ground preserved one small contact, while the longer chain of human movement remains mostly invisible. To see the footprint only as an isolated mark would make the past too thin. A person walking beside an ancient lake was also part of a living line of knowledge. No human being reaches a difficult landscape without some inheritance. Even if that inheritance is not written down, there may have been knowledge of water, movement, seasons, animals, safe ground, useful materials or nearby places, but the footprints alone cannot tell us the exact form of that knowledge. What they can show is that human presence had become real enough to leave repeated contact with the land. The beginning of human life in America, viewed this way, was not only the arrival of individuals, it was the continuation of human generations learning how to exist in a changing continent. Each generation would have received a world slightly different from the one before it. Ice shifted, water levels changed, animal ranges moved, shorelines altered, plants appeared or withdrew. A place that was useful in one period might become dry or difficult in another. To live through such conditions, people did not need written history in the modern sense, but they did need memory carried by living bodies. Memory could live in paths taken often, in warnings repeated, in habits learned by watching, in the way a group returned to water, avoided unstable ground, or recognized signs left by animals. Most of that memory vanished because it was never stored in stone or text. It passed through voices, gestures, and practice. When those voices ended, the knowledge ended with them unless another generation carried it forward. This is why the White Sands footprints feel like a fragment from a much larger inheritance. They are not just marks of feet, they are marks of continuity, even if the continuity cannot be fully reconstructed. A step in mud may be individual, but human survival is rarely individual. It depends on people before and beside the walker. It depends on learning that begins long before a single preserved moment. The footprints therefore widen the question of the title. Who walked there before history began? The honest answer cannot stop with one unnamed person. It has to include the possibility of a human world around that person, not in the form of invented scenes, but in the basic fact that people live through relationships and generations. We do not know their names. We do not know the structure of their group. We do not know how they described themselves. Yet the presence of human footprints in an ancient landscape implies more than a solitary point. It suggests that the human story had already reached that ground through a chain of living movement. The step we see is only the part that time allowed to remain. The steps before it may have crossed mud that dried and cracked, sand that blew away, stone that held nothing, grass that bent and rose again, or shorelines later covered by water. Those missing steps matter. They remind us that the earliest visible evidence is not always the earliest reality. The person who left a footprint at White Sands may be anonymous to us, but anonymity does not make the human line behind them empty. It only shows how much of early history lived without durable records. The mark in the ground is one preserved moment from a river of generations that mostly flowed beyond our sight. The footprints at White Sands do not all need to be imagined as the same kind of step. A human trackway can preserve differences in size, depth, spacing, and movement, though each detail must be read carefully and not push beyond what it can prove. Some marks may suggest smaller bodies, others larger bodies. Some paths may appear more direct, others more irregular, depending on the surface, preservation, and the way the foot met the ground. These differences matter because they make the ancient landscape feel less like the trace of one isolated figure and more like the remains of human presence across a living space. Still, caution is necessary. A smaller print does not automatically give us a complete story about age, role, family, or purpose. A larger print does not tell us identity, authority, strength, or intention. The ground preserved shapes, not biographies. What we can say is simpler and more powerful. The marks suggest that human bodies of more than one size moved through that place, and that the old lake margin may have been crossed repeatedly enough for the landscape to hold a pattern rather than a single lonely accident. This returns the mystery to the ordinary structure of human life. People are not only individuals walking alone through empty space. Human beings usually live among others, learn from others, and move through environments shaped by shared needs. In every known human society, young and old, stronger and weaker, experienced and inexperienced bodies must exist together, though their exact arrangements differ widely and cannot be assumed from ancient footprints alone. If the White Sands traces include different body sizes, they quietly remind us that early presence in America was not only a matter of bold explorers or abstract migrants. It may have included the ordinary range of human bodies that any living population carries. The deep beginning of people in a land is not made only by the fastest walkers. It is made by groups that must move, pause, remember, feed, protect, and continue. This does not require us to invent scenes of family life. It only asks us to remember that a population is made of generations, and generations are made of bodies at different stages of life. That thought changes the feeling of the footprints. A single adult step can suggest travel. A landscape with varied human impressions can suggest continuity, repetition, and a more complex use of space. The ancient lake margin becomes not just a place someone crossed once, but a place where human movement may have intersected with water, animals, mud, and daily survival more than once. Yet the evidence remains fragmentary. The prints do not tell us whether people were travelling together in one moment, returning over time, or crossing the same kind of ground in separate events. They do not tell us whether anyone was being guided, followed, carried, or watched. Those would be stories added from outside. What they do allow is a slower recognition. Before written history, human life was already social in the broad biological sense. Our species did not become human through solitary movement alone. From its beginnings, human survival depended heavily on learning, cooperation, memory, and the transfer of knowledge between bodies. A footprint beside an ancient lake cannot show the full network of that knowledge, but it can remind us that the person who made it likely belonged to a larger human world. The origin of human life in America, seen through this lens, becomes less like the arrival of a single mysterious walker and more like the presence of generations whose traces were mostly erased. The smallest surviving mark may carry the shadow of many missing lives. The larger mark may stand beside 1,000 vanished steps that left no readable shape. White Sands does not give us a crowd with faces. It gives us the possibility of human variety without the details that would make it easy to narrate. That is why it must be handled gently. The footprints are not proof of a scene we can fully reconstruct. They are proof that the ground once held human movement, and that movement may have belonged to more than one kind of body within the long continuity of people before history began. The deepest human history is mostly a history of people without names. This can be difficult to accept, because written history has trained the mind to look for rulers, cities, borders, dates, and voices that can still be quoted. But the older we go, the more those familiar supports disappear. Most of the people who carried our species through the largest share of its existence never entered a written record. They left no signature, no inscription, no personal account of what they feared, learned, remembered, or hoped would continue after them. Yet without them, there would be no later history at all. Every named civilization stands on a much longer foundation of unnamed lives. The White Sands footprints bring that truth down to the ground. They do not preserve a famous person. They do not point to a known leader or a recorded event. They preserve the pressure of ordinary human movement in a place where the land happened to remember. That may be their most important lesson. Before history became something written by a few, it was something carried by many. It was carried in walking, gathering, watching weather, learning routes, recognizing water, and passing knowledge from one living body to another. The people who walked near that ancient lake did not need to be recorded in writing for their lives to matter. Their existence was already part of the human beginning in America. The silence around their names does not make them smaller. It makes the surviving trace more moving, because it shows how much of humanity lived fully and then disappeared from memory almost completely. A footprint is not a biography, but it is a refusal of total absence. It says that someone was there, even when everything that would have made that person recognizable has gone. This is true far beyond white sands. Across deep time, human history was shaped by countless people whose bodies did the quiet work of survival. They learned landscapes before maps. They carried knowledge before books. They raised children before schools. They remembered paths before roads. They adapted to changing climates before science could name climate. None of this should be turned into a romantic picture of the past. Ancient life could be exposed, demanding, uncertain, and often dangerous. But the human value of those lives does not depend on whether they left monuments. The first long chapters of our species were not written in stone buildings. They were lived in bodies moving through forests, coasts, basins, grasslands, deserts, and ice margins. The footprints at White Sands belong to that older kind of history. They remind us that the beginning of a continent's human story may be visible first through the most humble evidence, a step pressed into mud. When the title asks who walked there before history began, one honest answer is that the walkers were part of the great unnamed majority of humanity. They were not invisible in their own time. They were visible to one another. They may have been known by voices, faces, kinship, habit, and memory within their world, but to us, across such distance, only the body's contact with Earth remains. That separation is painful in a quiet way. We can know that someone walked while not knowing the person. We can know that a human presence existed while not hearing the human voice. We can know that history was already unfolding, while lacking the names that would make it feel complete. This is where the footprints become more than evidence of early movement. They become a lesson in humility. They ask us to stop treating written memory as the beginning of importance. Long before records, people were shaping the future simply by continuing to live. Their steps carried knowledge forward. Their unnamed generations made later names possible. White Sands preserves only a few marks from that enormous human river, but those marks are enough to remind us that most of history was never written down. It was walked into the earth, and then almost entirely erased. The Ice Age is often imagined as a wall of cold, but for human beings it was more than temperature. It was a system of limits. Ice could block a route. Water could open one path and close another. A lake margin could offer life while also making the ground unstable. A season could change what was reachable. Animals could gather near water, but their presence could also make a place more dangerous or more difficult to read. Distance mattered differently when every movement depended on the body. In such a world, survival was not only the ability to endure cold air, it was the ability to live within boundaries that shifted slowly and sometimes without warning. The White Sands footprints belong to this larger setting. They were not pressed into a simple open land waiting to be crossed. They were made in a landscape shaped by climate, water, sediment, animals, and the heavy presence of glacial time across the continent. To speak of people walking there is to speak of people moving inside constraints far larger than themselves. Modern life often lets us think of movement as a choice. We decide to go somewhere, and roads, vehicles, lights, maps, and buildings carry much of the difficulty for us. In an Ice Age landscape, movement would have been more directly tied to what the Earth allowed. A body could only go where surfaces could be crossed, where water could be found or avoided, where weather did not make travel impossible, and where the group's knowledge could turn uncertainty into a livable path. This does not mean every day was extreme or dramatic. Ancient life should not be imagined as constant panic. But it did unfold inside a tighter relationship with environmental limits. The ground was not neutral, the air was not neutral, the presence or absence of water was not neutral. Even a place that offered resources could demand careful attention from every step. At White Sands, the ancient lake margin was part of that balance. Water could draw people, plants, and animals toward the basin. Mud could preserve signs of movement, but mud could also slow the foot. Open ground could make travel possible, but open ground could expose the body to wind, distance, or visibility. The human origin in America, seen from this angle, is not only a story of arrival, it is a story of bodies learning limits. Long before written records, humans had to understand where the world gave way and where it resisted. They learned not through abstract maps, but through repeated contact with real places. A frozen edge, a wet flat, a dry ridge, a shallow crossing, a shoreline, a sheltered hollow, each could matter because each changed what a body could do. The people behind the footprints were part of our species' long habit of living at the edge of possibility. Humans did not become successful by being stronger than climate. They survived by paying attention to it, adapting to it, remembering it, and sometimes moving when it changed. This is why the ice age around White Sands should not be treated as background scenery. It shaped the meaning of the step. It made the presence of human footprints more remarkable, not because it proves a dramatic story, but because it places ordinary human movement inside an extraordinary environmental frame. The great cold world did not need to be a frozen wasteland everywhere. It contained lakes, basins, animals, plants, wet surfaces, dry surfaces, and shifting habitats. But all of these existed under conditions different from the present, and those differences mattered to any human body trying to live there. The footprints are therefore marks of contact with a limited world. They show that people were there, but they also remind us that being there required more than simply appearing on a continent. It required finding ways through ice-shaped distance, through changing water, through animal landscapes, through the demands of walking, resting, watching, and continuing. The mystery of who walked there before history began becomes deeper when we remember that they walked not through emptiness, but through limits. For a human body, an ice age landscape was not experienced as a climate diagram. It was experienced through hunger, breath, weight, temperature, fatigue, and the need to keep moving without losing the thread of place. A person did not walk across a theory of glaciation. A person walked across ground. The foot met mud, dust, gravel, shallow water, or firm sediment. The leg adjusted. The body leaned. The eyes watched the surface ahead. The skin felt air and moisture. The ears listened for movement. The mind held some memory of where water had been found, where animals had passed, where the ground became dangerous, and where return might still be possible. This is why the White Sands footprints bring the Great Ice Age down to a human scale. They remind us that survival was not only a matter of being present on a map, it was a matter of bodies making countless small adjustments inside a world that could not be controlled. To walk near an ancient lake margin was to enter a place of both promise and uncertainty. Water could make life possible, but water also changed ground. Mud could hold a step, but it could also pull at the foot. Open basins could reveal distance, but they could also make the body feel exposed to wind, light, and weather. The people who left those prints were not floating above the landscape as symbols of migration. They were inside it, limited by the same physical facts that define human life everywhere. The body needs rest, food, warmth, balance, and direction. The deeper origin of the human story in America must be thought through this ordinary bodily reality. Before there were written names for places, before there were roads to guide movement, before later maps made continents seem fixed and knowable, people had to remember the world through repeated use. A path was not only a line, it was a habit of the body. A lake edge was not only a feature, it was a place that might be approached, avoided, followed, or crossed depending on conditions. A season was not only a point in a calendar, it was a change in what the land allowed. In such a world, memory was practical. It lived in the body and in the group. The shape of the land had to be learned slowly, by walking, returning, watching, and surviving. The footprints do not tell us exactly what those people knew. They do not give us their thoughts. But they do show that human bodies were already negotiating that environment long before written history could preserve the experience. This is the quiet force of the evidence. It does not show a grand event. It shows the result of living movement. A step pressed into mud because a body needed to go somewhere, or simply passed through a place where the ground could remember. Behind that step was the long human ability to adapt without fully mastering the earth. Humans are not the strongest animals. They are not protected by fur like many cold-adapted mammals. They do not outrun every predator or overpower every landscape. Their strength has often come from attention, cooperation, learning, and the capacity to carry memory across generations. In an Ice Age setting, those capacities would have mattered deeply. A group that understood where water gathered, where ground became difficult, or where animals moved had more than information. It had a living connection to place. White sands preserves only the physical trace, but the trace points toward that broader human condition. The old walkers were not modern people with modern comforts removed. They were people whose bodies belonged directly to their surroundings. Each step was part of a conversation between flesh and earth. The ground answered with firmness, softness, resistance, or danger. The body answered back with balance, caution, pressure, and movement. Today, we can speak about dates and glacial periods, but the footprint itself remains simpler. It says that in a world shaped by ice, water, distance, and change, human survival still came down to the body touching the ground and finding a way to continue. There is a paradox inside the White Sands footprints. Human beings were small compared with the Ice Age world around them. A body could be stopped by cold, distance, hunger, injury, water, mud, or weather. A person could not command the great ice sheets. A group could not stop a lake from changing, a season from turning, or a landscape from becoming dry. In the scale of climate, human beings were fragile, yet the marks they left have crossed a span of time so vast that many larger things disappeared. Lakes changed, shorelines withdrew, animal communities shifted. Later environments covered or erased older surfaces. The world that made the footprints no longer exists in the same form. Still, the pressure of feet remained. This is the quiet contradiction. The people were physically small, but their contact with the earth became durable. They did not need to build a monument. They did not need to carve a sign. They only walked across the right ground at the right moment, and the land kept a trace of them longer than anyone could have imagined. That is why the footprints feel more profound than their size. They show human weakness and human endurance at the same time. A step is vulnerable. It is brief. It can vanish under wind, water, or another foot. But in rare conditions, a step can outlast the world that produced it. The Ice Age, with all its limits, did not erase these particular marks. It framed them. It gave them their deep setting. The people who walked there were not stronger than climate, but they were present within it. They found ways to move through landscapes shaped by forces larger than themselves. This has been part of the human beginning everywhere. Our species did not spread because it escaped nature. It spread because bodies, minds, and communities learned to live inside nature's pressures. People crossed land by reading it, adapting to it, remembering it, and sometimes accepting what could not be changed. The White Sands footprints preserve one small result of that long human pattern. In a world still marked by ice, water, and uncertainty, someone continued forward. The mark that remains does not prove triumph in a dramatic sense. It does not say that life was easy. It does not say that people had mastered the continent. It says something quieter. Humans were there, and their bodies were durable enough in their habits, movements, and knowledge to leave evidence in a period that once seemed almost beyond reach. That thought gives the footprints their emotional weight. The ancient walkers did not need to know they were part of history. They did not need to know that a future world would argue over dates, routes, or models of arrival. Their lives were immediate. Ground, water, weather, food, rest, and other people would have mattered more than any future timeline. Yet from our distance, their ordinary movement becomes extraordinary because it survived the collapse of context. The body is gone. The voice is gone. The daily purpose is gone. The old lake is gone. But the meeting between foot and mud remains. It is almost as if the smallest human contact became stronger than the larger scene around it. This does not mean the footprints answer every question. They do not. They deepen the question by showing that human presence can appear where older expectations once left little room for it. They invite us to think of the first American past not as a simple line of arrival, but as a long human struggle with changing environments, most of it erased. The people were smaller than the climate, smaller than the ice, smaller than the continent, and smaller than time. Yet time did not remove them completely. It left the shape of movement. It left pressure in earth. It left a sign that before history had a voice, human beings were already walking through a difficult world, leaving behind evidence not of certainty, but of persistence. When written history begins, it can make everything before it feel dimmer than it truly was. Writing gives the past a voice that seems firm. A name can be copied. A law can be preserved. A trade can be recorded. A ruler can be remembered far beyond a normal lifetime. Because writing holds words still, the mind begins to trust it as the place where history truly starts. But the human story did not wait for writing to become real. Long before anyone wrote a date, long before people carved names into stone or pressed symbols into clay, human beings were already changing landscapes, following animals, learning water, making tools, raising children, and carrying memory through speech and practice. The problem is not that those earlier lives were less historical. The problem is that they were harder to preserve. A voice disappears unless it is remembered by another voice. A path disappears unless it is walked again. A camp can fade into soil. A shoreline can dry, flood, or move. But under rare conditions, matter itself can remember what words did not. This is why the white sands footprints matter so deeply, belong to a kind of history that is older than writing and less complete than writing, but not less real. They show that the body can become a record when no sentence survives. A written record tells us what someone chose, or was allowed, to put into words. A footprint tells us that a body was present before any explanation could be kept. These are very different kinds of evidence. Writing often comes from organized societies with systems of record, authority, trade, ritual, or administration. A footprint comes from contact with the ground. Writing may preserve a name while hiding the ordinary body. A footprint preserves the ordinary body while hiding the name. In one kind of history, we hear words but may lose the physical moment. In the other, we see the physical moment but lose the words around it. White Sands stands on that second side. It does not give us a speech from the first people of America. It gives us pressure in mud. It gives us the shape of feet beside an ancient lake. It gives us a human trace in a time when no written document could hold the story. The beginning of human life in America, therefore, cannot be measured only by the kinds of records that later civilizations left behind. It has to be measured by older, quieter forms of presence. Tracks, tools, sediments, bones, hearths, landscapes, and the careful relationship between them. This changes the way we think about history itself. History is not only what humans said about themselves, it is also what their bodies, objects, and environments left behind without speech. A footprint may not explain itself, but it still changes the scale of the past. It tells us that human life had already reached a place, even if human language did not survive there. The strange thing is that material evidence can be both more honest and more silent than writing. It cannot flatter itself. It cannot invent a royal lineage or exaggerate a victory. A footprint does not claim glory. But it also cannot answer the questions we most want to ask. It cannot tell us who the walker loved, feared, followed, or remembered. It cannot tell us whether the place was familiar or strange. It only holds the bodily fact. For this reason, the earliest American past must be approached as a partnership between what survives and what has vanished. Written history gives us voices from later worlds. Material history gives us traces from deeper time. At White Sands, the trace is almost painfully simple. Someone walked across soft ground. The mark. Endured. Later human beings found it and realized that a continent's story may have been unfolding long before any voice could be carried into the present. This is why one footprint can feel heavier than many written pages. It does not say much, but what it says reaches farther back than speech. A small discovery can change a large timeline because timelines are not the past itself. They are human arrangements made from the evidence available at a given moment. A line on a chart can look solid, but it is always resting on what has survived, what has been found, and what has been understood well enough to trust. When new evidence appears from a deeper layer of time, the line does not simply receive another dot. Sometimes the whole shape of the line has to loosen. White Sands has this quiet effect. The footprints are physically modest, but they place human movement in North America at a time that asks older models to become wider and less certain. They do not give a complete replacement story, and they do not remove the need for other kinds of evidence. Yet they show that one preserved surface can make a continent's human past feel longer than a neat summary once allowed. This is how archaeology often changes thought, not always through a huge monument or an object made to impress, but through a small thing whose age and context are difficult to ignore. A seed, a bone fragment, a hearth stain, a stone flake, a strand of preserved material, a footprint in mud. Each can become important when it sits in the right layer and connects to the right question. The power comes from relationship. A trace alone means little if it floats without context. A trace in a datable setting, tied to a landscape and compared with other evidence, can become a point of pressure. It asks whether the old explanation still fits. At White Sands, the trace is not only old, it is bodily. It says that human beings were not merely possible in theory, they were physically present, pressing their feet into a wet surface in a landscape very different from the present. That physical presence forces a slower reconsideration of arrival, movement, and time. It also reminds us that the first visible evidence is rarely the full beginning. The earliest surviving mark may come after many unpreserved movements. The first place we can see clearly may not be the first place people reached. The beginning of human life in America may therefore be older than the strongest surviving trace, because preservation is uneven and time is selective. This does not mean we can push the story backward without evidence. It means the evidence we do have should make us careful about drawing the edge too sharply. The footprints do not say, "Here is the whole beginning." They say, "The beginning was already underway by the time this ground remembered a step." That sentence changes the scale of the question. It moves the mind away from a single arrival point and toward a deeper process of generations, landscapes, roots, and missing traces. For modern people, this can be hard to feel because a date looks final once printed. But scientific timelines are not sacred objects. They are working structures. They improve when evidence improves. They become stronger when they bend, instead of pretending that old simplicity must remain untouched. The footprints are valuable because they do not demand belief in fantasy. They demand attention to a real mark in real earth. Their importance lies in the calm pressure they place on the frame around them. If humans were walking there in such an ancient period, then the story of America before history began cannot be treated as a short preface to later events. It was already long, already embodied, already shaped by climate and movement, long before names and records could hold it still. This is why one quiet trackway can feel larger than its surface. It does not fill the missing past, but it stretches the room in which the past must be understood. It reminds us that human beginnings are often discovered from below, not announced from above, and that a continent's earliest human chapters may survive first as pressure, shadow, sediment, and silence. Before written history, time was not empty, but it was harder to hold. A year could pass without being counted in a way that reached us. A place could be known deeply without appearing on any map. A life could be full of movement, knowledge, affection, danger, and decision, yet leave no name for the future to repeat. This is the kind of time the White Sands footprints bring us into. It is not a time before humans had meaning. It is a time before meaning could be stored in the forms modern history usually trusts. The people who walked near that ancient lake lived inside days that were real to them, but most of those days dissolved without becoming records. The ground kept only the pressure of feet. That is why the discovery feels almost like a message from a world that had no messenger. It does not speak in language. It does not explain itself. It simply remains, and by remaining, it forces us to admit that human life in America was already unfolding before history had a voice that could reach the present. To live in such a time was not to live outside memory. Human beings have always depended on memory. But before writing, memory had to live in bodies and relationships. It had to be carried by speech, habit, gesture, and repeated return to places. A route could be remembered because people walked it. A water source could be remembered because it mattered. A dangerous surface could be avoided because someone had learnt it before. A child could inherit knowledge without ever seeing a symbol carved on stone. This kind of memory is powerful while people carry it. but fragile across deep time. When the chain of voices ends, the memory becomes almost impossible for distant observers to recover. The origin of human life in America, when seen through white sands, belongs to that fragile world. It was not silent in its own moment, but it has become silent to us. The footprints are what remain after speech, habit, and local knowledge have disappeared. They pull the listener toward a strange kind of historical darkness, not a darkness of ignorance alone, but a darkness filled with lives that were once fully awake. Modern history often moves from event to event because events can be named. A battle, a kingdom, a migration, a city, a written law, these things are easier to place in order. But before history began in the written sense, human time may have felt more like continuity than event. The same landscape could be crossed many times. The same lake margin could change slowly. Generations could inherit knowledge without making a permanent mark. People could live through important changes that no surviving record would ever call important. A climate shift, a dry season, the movement of animals, the disappearance of a familiar source of water, all could shape life deeply while leaving only scattered traces. White Sands offers one of those traces, but it does not turn the whole continuity into a clear story. It only shows that in that long, unnamed time, human bodies were present. They were already moving through the continent. They were already part of the land's changing rhythms. This brings the question back to its quiet center. Who walked there before history began? Not people from a blank world, and not characters from a finished legend. They were human beings living in a form of time that was rich to them and nearly unreachable to us. They did not need writing for their days to matter. They did not need maps for the land to be known. They did not need future observers for their lives to be real. Yet from our side, almost all of that reality has fallen away. What remains is a footprint, a surface, an age, a landscape, and a question. The mark does not allow us to hear the past, but it lets us know the past had already begun. Before history could tell the story, human feet were already carrying it forward. Between the ancient footprint and the person who made it lies a field of disappearance. The mark survived, but almost everything that gave the step its full human meaning is gone. The sound of the day is gone. The voices near the lake are gone. The small habits of movement, rest, warning, teaching, and recognition are gone. If there was a path used more than once, most of it did not remain. If there was a place where people paused, ate, repaired tools, watched animals, or waited for better conditions, it may have vanished without leaving a clear sign. The footprint gives us contact, but not context in its living fullness. That is what makes it both precious and severe. It proves that a body was there, but it does not return the world that surrounded that body. A person is never only a foot pressing into mud. A person belongs to a web of others, to learned places, to repeated gestures, to needs that rise and fade through a day. Time took nearly all of that away. It left a shape in the ground, while removing the life that made the shape ordinary. This loss is not unusual in deep history. It is the rule. Most of the human past disappeared before it could become evidence. A campfire burned and cooled. A spoken warning ended in the air. A route across a basin was remembered for a while, then forgotten, or changed when water moved and ground dried. A useful plant may have grown in one season and not another. A familiar animal path may have shifted. A child may have learned where to place a foot on wet ground, and that knowledge may have mattered deeply, but nothing in the footprint can preserve that lesson as a lesson. The beginning of human life in America was made from countless such fragile acts. It was not made only from the traces that survived. It was made from what people did again and again, most of which the earth did not keep. This is why the White Sands footprints should be seen as a narrow opening, not a complete window. Through that opening, we see the fact of human presence, but the wider room remains dark. The relationships behind the step are gone. We do not know who walked beside whom. We do not know whether a person was following a known line of movement or crossing a surface only once. We do not know what the walkers noticed in the sky, the water, the mud, or the animals nearby. We do not know what mattered most in that moment. These missing things are not small decorations around the real history. They are much of the real history. Human beings live through relationships and habits, not only through events that leave durable marks. The loss between the footprint and us is therefore a human loss, not only an archaeological one. It reminds us that the earliest history of a continent was carried in bodies, voices, and memory before it was carried in objects. When those bodies died and those voices stopped, only a few materials could continue speaking in their own silent way. Mud could preserve pressure, stone could preserve shaping, bone could preserve anatomy, charcoal could preserve fire, but none of these can preserve a whole human world by themselves. The first people in America were not less real because the record is broken. They were more like most humans who have ever lived, known in their own time, then almost entirely unknown to later time. The footprint is a survivor from that enormous disappearance. It asks us to respect both what remained and what did not. If we focus only on the mark, we may forget the life around it. If we invent the life too freely, we may betray the mark. The honest path is quieter. We can say that people walked there in a deep Ice Age landscape. We can say that the land once held water, mud, animals, and human movement. We can say that a moment of bodily contact crossed thousands of years and reached us. But we must also say that the camp, the spoken memory, the social world, the ordinary fear, the skill, the fatigue, the return, and the reason for the step have mostly disappeared. What remains is not the whole story. It is the edge of a story that time almost erased. If the people who left the White Sands footprints had a reason for being there, that reason has not survived in a form we can read. This is one of the hardest limits of deep history. The mark tells us that someone crossed the ground. It does not tell us why. A modern mind wants to fill that space quickly. It wants to imagine a hunt, a journey, a return to camp, a search for water, a moment of danger, or a path followed by memory. Some of those possibilities may sound reasonable in a broad human sense, because people do move for water, food, safety, social connection, and habit. But the footprint itself does not choose one of them for us. It holds the pressure of a body, not the purpose of a mind. This is where honesty must be patient. To say that a life stood behind the print is fair. To say exactly what that life was thinking in that moment would be more than the evidence allows. The older the past becomes, the more tempting it is to make it feel complete by giving ancient people a voice they did not leave. But the White Sands footprints are powerful precisely because they do not become a full voice. They remain a bodily trace. They remind us that the first human stories in America were lived by real people whose inner worlds are almost entirely beyond recovery. That does not make those people distant in every way. Their bodies needed many of the same basic things human bodies have always needed. Water mattered, rest mattered, food mattered, warmth and protection mattered. Other people likely mattered, because human survival has long depended on social life and shared knowledge. But these broad truths do not let us open the mind of one walker beside an ancient lake. They only give us the frame of human existence. Within that frame, the details are gone. The step may have been part of an ordinary movement across familiar ground. It may have been part of a longer journey. It may have happened during a day that felt unremarkable to the person who made it. We cannot know. What we can know is that the body moved through a landscape shaped by mud, water, climate, and time, and that the ground preserved the movement while losing the motive. The beginning of human life in America, seen through this absence, becomes less like a story waiting to be narrated and more like a real world seen through a narrow crack. We glimpse the contact, not the cause. We see that a person existed there, not what the person intended. This restraint is not coldness toward the past. It is a form of respect. Ancient people should not be turned into characters for our convenience. They do not need invented thoughts to become human. Their humanity is already present in the trace itself, because only a living body could make it. A footprint does not contain a face, but it contains presence. It does not contain speech, but it contains contact. It does not contain memory, but it proves that memory once may have moved through that place in bodies that are gone. The true loss is that the life behind the step cannot be restored whole. The path before and after the mark may have vanished. The reason for crossing that ground may have vanished. The relationships surrounding the walker may have vanished. Yet the evidence remains enough to prevent total disappearance. It says that before written history, Before named groups can be safely spoken from the evidence, before the continent's later stories became visible, a human being entered that mud with weight and direction. To look at the footprint honestly is to let it stay incomplete. The mark does not need our certainty. It needs our attention. It asks us to hold two truths at once. Someone truly walked there, and the reason they walked there is mostly lost. There is a strange humility that comes from finding real evidence. At first, a discovery seems to give the past more shape. A footprint appears, a date is studied, a landscape is reconstructed, and the old silence seems to loosen. We know more than we knew before. Human beings were there. They walked near an ancient lake. Their steps entered mud during a world shaped by ice. The evidence has weight, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But once the first wonder settles, another feeling rises beside it. The more clearly we see the footprint, the more clearly we see everything the footprint cannot hold. It gives us presence, but not identity. It gives us movement, but not the full journey. It gives us age, but not origin. It gives us a body in contact with Earth, but not the life that surrounded that body. This is not failure. This is the normal condition of deep history. Evidence does not remove mystery in a single motion. Often, it sharpens the edge of the mystery until we can see exactly where knowledge ends. White Sands teaches this very gently. The footprints are not vague. They are not meaningless. They are real traces in real ground. Yet their reality does not make them complete. They stand like small islands in a wide, dark water, and because the islands are real, the water around them becomes more visible. That is the quiet discipline of science when it looks into the oldest human past. It does not simply collect answers. It also learns how to measure uncertainty. It asks what can be said, what cannot be said, and what must remain open until stronger evidence appears. The origin of human life in America becomes more honest when treated this way. We do not need to pretend that the footprints solve every question in order to understand their importance. They matter because they extend the human presence into a deep Ice Age setting. They matter because they challenge any story that made the continent's human beginning too narrow or too late without enough room for new evidence. They matter because they show that a small trace can force a large timeline to breathe. But they also matter because they refuse to become more than a trace. They do not tell us one final route. They do not reveal one complete population story. They do not name the walkers. They do not show whether the ground was crossed once or many times by the same people, or by different people in different moments, beyond what careful study can support. Every honest answer must stand beside an honest limit. This is especially important for a video about a mystery before history began. Mystery should not become permission to invent. It should become an invitation to listen more carefully to what remains. The footprints show that the past is not empty where records are absent, but they also show that absence cannot be filled by desire. The missing voices, missing names, missing paths, missing camps, and missing memories are real losses. They are not puzzles that can be solved by confidence alone. Future research may clarify some things. New methods may refine dates. New sites may appear. Old landscapes may be reinterpreted. But even with more discoveries, there will always be a distance between a surviving trace and a living world. That distance is part of the human story. It reminds us that most of our species live beyond the reach of permanent record, and that our knowledge of them comes through fragments that survive by chance, care, and natural preservation. White Sands does not give us a full beginning. It gives us a beginning that can be felt through the body and questioned through evidence. A foot pressed down, the earth kept the pressure. Time erased almost everything else. The more we learn from that mark, the more we understand that the unknown around it is not empty at all. It is filled with vanished human life, too old to speak, but not too old to leave a trace. Now the story returns to its quiet center. A footprint, a vanished lake, a white desert, and a question that cannot be closed too quickly. After moving through ice, mud, roots, silence, generations, and the limits of evidence, the marks at White Sands still remain modest in appearance. They are not large structures. They are not carved stones. They are not written accounts left by people who wanted to be remembered. They are shapes made when human feet pressed into soft ground near an ancient body of water. Yet around those shapes, an entire older world begins to gather. The place was not always the dry white landscape that visitors see today. It once belonged to a basin where water, sediment, plants, animals, and climate created surfaces that could briefly hold movement. The people who crossed that ground lived in a time shaped by the late Ice Age, when the continent was not the same as the continent on a modern map. Huge glacial systems affected the wider north. Sea levels, coastlines, habitats, and possible routes differed from the present. In that world, a step was never only a step. It was a contact between a living body and a landscape that offered both possibility and limit. This is why the footprints carry such quiet force. They gather the physical truth of human presence without pretending to give a full story. We can return again to the question in the title, but now it feels heavier than it did at the beginning. Who walked there before history began? The most honest answer begins simply: humans did. People with bodies like ours in the broad human sense. People who had weight, balance, feet, fatigue, attention, and the need to move through real ground. But the answer cannot safely go much farther without evidence. We do not know their names. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called the water, the basin, the animals, or themselves. We do not know whether a particular step belonged to a familiar crossing, a passing day, a return, or a longer movement through a changing landscape. The footprints show presence. They do not reveal identity in full. This is not a disappointment. It is the truth of deep history. The older the human past becomes, the more we meet people through fragments rather than voices. White sands is powerful because the fragment is so bodily. It reminds us that before history became written, before memory could be stored in durable symbols, before later cultures made the continent easier for us to describe, human life was already happening in mud. Water, weather, movement, and memory carried by living people. A footprint is small, but it refuses the idea that nothing was there. It tells us that the silence before written history was not empty. It was filled with lives that mostly did not survive as records. The ancient lake is gone. The daily knowledge of those walkers is gone. The exact path before and after the preserved marks is gone. The voices are gone. But the ground kept pressure, and pressure is enough to change the scale of the story. It asks us to see early America not as a blank space waiting for later history, but as a land already touched by human movement in a world very different from our own. The lesson is not that every mystery has been solved. The lesson is that a small piece of evidence can teach us how to be careful. It can widen the timeline while keeping humility alive. It can show that humans were present and still leave the deeper question open. White sands does not hand us a finished beginning. It leaves us standing beside an ancient surface, looking at the mark of a step, and realizing that history may begin long before it learns how to speak. The most valuable lesson from the White Sands footprints may be that history is larger than the forms that usually make it visible. Many people first learn history through kings, empires, wars, cities, monuments, borders, and written records. Those things matter, but they come late in the long human story. For most of our species' existence, there were no stone inscriptions to preserve a name, no official record to mark an event, no city archive to hold a memory, and no map to turn lived land into a fixed shape. Yet people were still living historically. They were changing the future by surviving the present. They were learning landscapes, carrying knowledge, moving through seasons, adapting to water and cold, and passing on what a younger body needed to know. The footprints in America, pressed into ancient ground before written history could speak, remind us that human importance does not begin with power or writing. It begins with presence. It begins when a body stands in a place, responds to that place, and becomes part of its long record, even if only by accident. This is why the discovery has educational value beyond the question of a date. It teaches a different way to look at the past. A footprint does not flatter the person who made it. It does not claim ownership of land. It does not announce a victory. It does not say, "Remember me." It simply remains as a trace of contact. In that modest form, it brings us closer to the deeper beginning of humanity than many grander objects can. A monument may show organization, belief, authority, or labor. A written tablet may show speech captured in signs, but a footprint shows the body before explanation. It shows that before people built systems to record themselves, they already belonged to environments that shaped every day. At White Sands, the environment included a basin, ancient water, soft ground, changing climate, and the larger pressure of the Ice Age world. To understand the prints is to understand that early history must be read through earth as well as through words. The ground itself can become a record, though never a complete one. That lesson is useful because modern people often confuse visibility with importance. What survives is not always what mattered most. Stone survives better than speech. Bone may survive better than care. A hard object may outlast a lifetime of teaching. A single footprint may remain when every relationship around it has disappeared. This does not mean the relationship was unimportant. It means the material world is selective. It keeps some things and loses others. The first human chapters in America were likely full of knowledge that no archive preserved. Where water gathered, how the ground changed, when animals moved, where the body could rest, which places had to be approached carefully. The footprints do not reveal those details, but they make room for their former existence. They remind us that a life can be real, useful, intelligent, and connected even when almost nothing remains for later observers. That is a quiet correction to how we often measure the past. We tend to look for greatness in size, permanence, and clear names. Deep history asks for another kind of attention. It asks us to notice small evidence, unfinished evidence, evidence that does not explain itself. It asks us to respect people who cannot speak back, and to avoid making them say what the record does not support. The White Sands footprints are therefore not only a mystery about who walked there before history began, they are also a lesson in how to think about the human past without rushing to own it. They show that the beginning of America's human story is not only a matter of arrival, it is a matter of listening to a continent's oldest surviving human traces with enough patience to let them remain both meaningful and incomplete. If we can learn that patience from a footprint, then even silence becomes a kind of teacher. The White Sands footprints leave us with something rare, a human beginning that is visible, but not fully knowable. After all the dates, all the debates, all the careful study of mud, seeds, sediments, and ancient landscapes, the central image remains very small. A foot touched the earth yielded, the shape stayed. That is all, and somehow it is enough to make the past feel much larger. It tells us that before written history, before the continent could be described by outsiders, before names could be preserved in records, human beings were already moving through America in a world shaped by ice, water, distance, and change. They were not waiting for history to begin. They were living inside it, even if their own words did not survive. This is the final lesson of the footprints. History is not only what people wrote down, it is also what bodies endured, what landscapes preserved, and what time almost erased. A monument can be built for memory, but a footprint survives without intention. It does not ask to be honored. It does not explain who made it. It does not tell us a homeland, a language, or a story of arrival. It only gives back the simplest fact of human presence. Someone was there. Someone walked across soft ground near an ancient lake, in a period so far away that the land itself has changed its face. The lake is gone. The mud became part of a buried and exposed record. The living world around those steps has mostly disappeared. Yet the trace remains, and its quietness teaches caution. It teaches that a real discovery does not need exaggeration to matter. It teaches that the unknown should not be filled too quickly, because the people who lived before history deserve more respect than our imagination alone can give them. They were not symbols. They were not mysteries created for us. They were human beings whose lives were complete to themselves, even though only fragments reached us. In that sense, the footprints are both evidence and reminder. They widen the story of America's human past, but they also remind us how fragile every human record is. Most lives leave no durable sign. Most voices disappear. Most memories depend on someone else carrying them forward. The people at White Sands lived in a chain of generations, and most of that chain is now beyond recovery. Still, One surface remembered what nearly everything else forgot. That small survival should change the way we think about the deep past. It should make us gentler with uncertainty. It should make us more patient with incomplete evidence. It should help us understand that science is not weakened when it says, "We know this much, and no more." The footprints do not close the story. They keep it open in the most honest way. They show that human history in America reaches into a colder, older world, but they do not hand us the full map of how those people came, how they lived, or what they carried in memory. What remains is a mark of pressure, a trace of movement, and a question large enough to outlast certainty. Perhaps that is why the footprints feel so close at bedtime, when the world becomes quiet and the mind slows down. They remind us that every human life, ancient or modern, is partly a step into the unknown. We move, we leave marks, and most of them fade. But sometimes the earth remembers, and if a single footprint can survive when a whole world has vanished, who were the people whose steps reached us, and how much of their world is still walking silently beneath the ground?